All right, well, defence policy, at least as it connects with AUKUS as a project, will be run by the Albanese government in full knowledge that it has coalition support for everything around the nuclear-powered submarine enterprise. Now, that will marginalise to some extent the Greens, but they've still expressed some strong doubts on expense and even on the necessity of all of this. Their defence spokesman, David Shoebridge, joins us now. David, welcome to the program. I do detect, likewise. I do detect a little bit of crossover between Paul Keating's outlook on China and Green's foreign policy. Do his criticisms today of AUKUS resonate with you?
Well, I often find myself a critic of what Paul Keating says, and the Greens often do. But on his core claim today that that foreign policy in Australia has been literally taken over by the defence industries and taken over by the ADF at the cost of Australia's long-term strategic interests, well then yes, I'd agree with what Paul Keating has said. And indeed, one of the core criticisms we heard today is echoed by the critique we gave of this AUKUS arrangement, which is largely Australia has surrendered its sovereignty on defence matters to the United States. We are spending probably well north of $386 billion buying a weapons system that we will not be able to crew, we will not be able to operate, and we definitely will not be able to deploy without the active consent of the United States military. And if that is not a surrender of our sovereignty, then I don't know what is.
But that active consent is explicitly given, isn't it, by virtue of the arrangement laid out yesterday. We don't get to own one of these Virginia-class submarines with, as you say, all that American tech on board unless they explicitly yield it unto us.
Well, we don't get to own them. We don't get to purchase them at huge cost to the Australian taxpayer, a huge benefit to the United States military contractors and to UK military contractors. We don't get to get through the door without the US consent. But more fundamental than that, we will not be able to deploy them without their consent. And it's very likely they will be deployed in the future at the direction of the United States, and we will have little, if any, say in that. Australians do not want our military, our huge amount of public expenditure, to be a small, non-independent unit of the US military's presence in North Asia.
Is China a threat, an emerging threat to continental Australia in the form of designs on some type of invasion?
No credible analyst thinks that there's an invasion threat to Australia from China. And indeed, these nuclear submarines are not really designed to do continental protection of Australia. You could provide a far more comprehensive protection of the maritime approaches of Australia through a much larger, expanded conventional submarine fleet at a fraction of the cost. These submarines, these boats, are not designed for the continental protection of Australia. They are designed to aggressively project force into the South China Sea, to pre-position force in the South China Sea. And it's no wonder there's not just China, but Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia and others see it as the destabilising move that they do. Why
would that be a flawed strategy for the defence of Australia, though? That's called forward defence, as we understand it. What would be wrong with that if there was some advancing force towards Australia?
Well, the great likelihood is we will be caught up in a conflict that is not at all about the defence of Australia. We will be caught up in a conflict that may well be clearly in the economic or imperial interests of the United States, their military interests, and be embroiled in a conflict where we don't even have consent on it. We are literally dragged into yet another disastrous American war without any say from the Australian public, without any say from the Australian Parliament, and maybe even without any say from the Australian Prime Minister and Defence Ministers. We are, with this project, effectively becoming a $386 billion fully funded subsidiary of the United States military, not about defending Australia, but about advancing the United States military and economic interests in North Asia. I don't think Australians want to see this huge expenditure for Australia to be effectively the nuclear-powered poodle of the United States.
All right, let's explore expenditure, because I observed, David Shoebridge, in the introduction that the Greens are somewhat marginalised where the coalition supports all of this. But even so, you'll be asked to vote on various budget measures this year and the year after that, and who knows, probably for decades. What lines do you draw around support for revenue measures or cost cutting that apparently will be absolutely necessary to deliver these submarines?
Well, first of all, let's be clear why the coalition is supporting this package from Labor. It's not because they agree with Labor's package. It's because the Albanese Labor government is fully implementing the deal that the hard-right Morrison government cut with the United States. So it's little wonder that the coalition are cheering this in, because Labor is implementing the coalition's dangerous, hugely expensive project, and we will not be supporting a single budget cut to pay for this project. And we've already seen the coalition suggesting that there could be savage cuts to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. We know that there's pressures on the aged care budget. We know that public health through Medicare is under pressure. And we've already seen the government effectively refuse to fund the housing crisis. Yeah. So we will not be supporting a single budgetary cut to those core critical services in order to fund the AUKUS, this huge expenditure. And I think we should be clear as well that the $368 billion is not a figure that's been frontlined by the government. They've refused to say what the real long-term likely costs will be. Yeah. I've never yet before heard of a program which they talk about the cost in terms of a proportion of GDP. I don't think they're still being honest with us about the real cost. All
right, but just on some of those spending areas that you identified there, the truth is you'd never know. They don't come with a tag. A savings measure doesn't come with a tag on it that says asterisk for AUKUS submarines. You'd never know.
Well, what we do know is, between Labor agreeing with the coalition's stage 3 tax cuts, $250-odd billion of stage 3 tax cuts, and now agreeing with the coalition's nuclear submarine AUKUS project, there's at least $620 billion of expenditure and tax cuts, which are going to fundamentally shift the federal fiscal strategy by giving hundreds of millions of dollars to the wealthiest, hundreds of billions of dollars to foreign defence contractors, at a time when we desperately need that money for core services in this country. And we will not be assisting Labor to get any of that through.
Yeah, all right. Well, I'm sure we'll return to that in budget debates, as I say, for many years to follow. David Shoebridge, we'll leave it there, though, for today. Thanks so much for joining us from Sydney.
Thanks, Greg.
OK, we're going to bring in our political panel today, and it's another all-Victorian combination. We have Labor MP and member for Wilts. He's also chair of Parliament's Joint Committee on Intelligence Security. Peter Khalil is with us, and Liberal MP and member for Flinders, Zoe McKenzie, joins us now. Welcome to both of you. And Zoe, I promise I won't turn this into an interview on Paul Keating with our ALP member Peter Khalil, but kind of irresistibly, I do have to start there.
I'm sure you're going to talk about it, Greg.
Yeah, let's go. All right. So former Prime Ministers, like former Presidents, Peter, command esteemed places in a nation's political history. Paul Keating's views, I think it's fair to say, are diametrically opposed to current Labor thinking. Is he recklessly endangering the AUKUS alliance?
Well, first of all, I have great respect for Paul Keating as one of our great Prime Ministers, but he has seriously misrepresented the government's approach on AUKUS and the strategic environment that we face today. It's not the benign world that he was living in the 1990s. The world has changed considerably, and that strategic environment is one in which there's been the largest conventional military build-up, unprecedented really, since World War II, where there's been a militarisation of the South China Sea. There's been obviously economic barriers placed on our exports by China, And there is a strategic contest at the heart of this between models of governance, whether it's a liberal democratic model with an international rule of law and a framework around security and trade and human rights that we live in, or a model in which authoritarian states get to do what they want, when they want, because of their ability to use force. Right. And I just make this point that Keating fundamentally is wrong about. The capability acquisition that is within AUKUS is important because it raises our ability to contribute to what I would call collective deterrence amongst a number of nations across the region. So it's not just the US and UK. There are other nations who have an interest in protecting that liberal rules-based order.
All right.
And that deterrence is important to deter, frankly, countries from using force as a means to reach their strategic goals. We want to avoid confrontation. We want to avoid conflict. And the best way to do that is to make sure your capability and your defence is good enough and strong enough to make sure that it is part of a deterrent effect on that.
Well,
There's an old saying,
Go on.
there's an old